Hello everyone! With the rise of the cloud, we've also seen the rise of related technologies such as infrastructure as code. Now, infrastructure as code is a means of automatically and reliably managing complex infrastructures, and one language that enables that is Ansible. Now, Ansible is a configuration management language, meaning that we can use it to set up and configure our machines. For example, if you want to install Nginx, we're going to tell Ansible, here's a couple of tasks. The first one installs Nginx. The second one actually installs its configuration. But of course, the way I'm installing Nginx right now is probably quite similar to the way you'd be installing Nginx on your own machine, so we can reuse all of these definitions in roles. Roles can also contain default variables, and these sorts of variables can be changed by the user of a role to, for example, customize the behavior of a role or change configuration values that the role installs. Now, if you want to share this role with other users, we also need some sort of metadata attached to it, and that can include things like the role's name, its author, and the license that it has, but also importantly, the platforms that it supports. Ansible operates the Ansible Galaxy ecosystem, which is a registry of over 25,000 open source roles contributed by nearly 6,000 authors. Ansible Galaxy can kind of be seen as the Maven or the NPM of Ansible. And all of these roles can kind of be seen as libraries. But of course, these roles also evolve. And when a role evolves, new releases are made, and these releases have to be tagged with a version. To do that, Ansible recommends using semantic versioning. Now, semantic versioning is a format that we've all probably seen before, the traditional format of major.minor.patch. But as the name implies, semantic versioning carries some semantics. For example, software using semantic versioning must declare a public API, and any backwards incompatible change to this API has to be paired with a major version increment. Similarly, if you add new functionality to this interface, you have to increment the minor version, and then finally patch versions are reserved for things like bug fixes, optimizations, and potentially refactorings. Now, Ansible recommends the format of semantic versioning, but doesn't say anything about the semantics. It just simply says, we're going to scan all of the tags of your repository, and anything that matches the format will import as metadata. But then the question becomes, what is the interface of a role, and what is a breaking change to this interface or the addition of functionality? And more importantly, can I, as a user of a role, reasonably assume that something like, for example, a patch version doesn't contain any breaking changes and doesn't add shiny new features that I'd like to check out? To investigate this question, we collected a dataset containing more than 24,500 roles collected from Galaxy. We also cloned all of their repositories and extracted the tags in these repositories, leading to roughly 81,000 versions for us to inspect and analyze, and we also later checked the changes that happened in these versions, but more on that later. So the first question we ask ourselves is, do role developers actually adhere to something that at least looks like semantic versioning? And we found that 92% of the versions actually syntactically look like a semantic version following the x.y.c format. What we also found is that your average role contains a lot more patches than it does minors, and a lot more minor releases than there are major versions. Which of course makes sense if you think about it, because bug fixes are plentiful and major versions contain breaking changes which you should avoid at all costs. Similarly, we also found that major versions take a lot more effort to create than minor versions, which again take a lot more effort to create than patch versions, which also makes sense if you think about it, because bug fixes are quite easy to make, whereas adding completely new functionality is going to take a bit more effort. So in general, these observations are in line with things you would find in Java or JavaScript or things like that. So you might be asking yourself the question, Ruben, why are you even saying this? Because these are expected results, right? And they are if these role developers are indeed following something like semantic versioning. But if they were choosing these versions randomly, you wouldn't find these sorts of patterns. So this really suggests that these semantics are there. So the next question becomes, what are these semantics actually? So we looked into what syntactical changes occur in role releases, and more specifically, which components are changed in these role releases. We found that in general, most of the role releases actually change the tasks and the default variables. And we also found that major releases just generally change more components than minors, which again change more components than patches. What we also found is that these changes generally co-occur. For example, default variables are edited on their own in about 6% of releases, but 8.5% of releases actually change both the default variables and tasks. So these changes, they kind of codepend on each other, and unfortunately, because of that, we don't really find anything that really stands out as saying this type of change only happens in a major release and is therefore a breaking change, or this type of change rarely happens in a patch, so this is likely the addition of a feature. Of course, we also have to keep in mind that syntactical changes may include things like whitespace changes, refactorings, and other sorts of things that aren't really interested to our question. So instead, we looked at the structure overall, and we developed a structural model to actually represent this. So the structural model contains things like files in a role, which, for example, files in a task directory may contain blocks, and these blocks in turn contain tasks, and these tasks contain all of the information about an individual task that Ansible would execute. Similarly, files in the defaults folder contain variables, and these variables of course have a name and a value. So we take the source of all of these roles and we parse it and convert it to this hierarchical tree model, and we get these structural models of roles. Then we actually want to know what kind of structural changes happen between two versions of a role. So given the structural representation of two versions of this role, we need to be able to extract concrete changes. For that, we implemented a structural differencing algorithm that uses domain-specific knowledge to extract over 40 different concrete change types. For example, for these two trees that we see on the left-hand side, we get a summary of the changes that happen between them, and then we can count the number of occurrences of each of these change types, which gives us metrics of the structural differences between two role versions. In this case, we find 2 additions of default variables and 1 edit of a task. So given these structural changes, we want to reevaluate whether we can find the semantics in role versioning. The main thing that we find is that 30% of role releases actually don't contain any structural change whatsoever. This means that these role releases only contain syntactical refactorings or changes to components that aren't present in the structural model, like tests, for example. We can also see that comparing the popular components on a structural level to the popular components on a syntactical level, that the rankings actually changed quite drastically. For example, default variables are now the most important component for a role release, whereas on a syntactical level it was the tasks. But we still aren't really able to find any distinguishing factor in what distinguishes a major release from a minor release or a minor release from a patch. So instead, we decided to ask the developers. We contacted 22 popular role developers that had a public email listed on their Galaxy profile, and we received a reply from 6 of them. The first question that we asked them is whether or not they follow semantic versioning, and 5 of them actually confirmed that they do, but one of those 5 actually said that they're not very strict about it, and the final developer said that they're actually not following the semantic versioning specifications at all, and are just using the format. So secondly, we asked them what kind of changes caused them to do a certain version bump. And for major versions, we generally find that things like removing variables or renaming variables, removing platforms or changing the type of a variable is considered to be a breaking change. But one of the developers also mentioned that it depends on the feel of it, because they feel like renaming a variable isn't too big of a deal and shouldn't really be a major version. Similarly, adding new variables or new behavior to the role is considered to be the addition of functionality and therefore should lead to a minor version, even though one of the developers also mentions things like optimizations and internal code refactorings as reasons for a minor version. Finally, patch versions are, as expected, things like solving issues, fixing bugs, and making tweaks to the code. Finally, we asked the developers what they think the interface of a role would be, and they all unanimously agreed that it is the default variables that a role accepts. Finally, to confirm these findings, we trained a random forest classifier to predict the applicable version bump given the structural difference metrics that we extracted earlier. We first used recursive feature elimination to isolate the most distinguishing structural difference metrics for this classification problem, and in general we found that things like the addition or the removal of variables, the addition or the removal of tasks, the addition of a platform, the edit of a task, these sorts of things are the most important to distinguish between different versions. And then on the other hand, things like handlers or relocations of files, renames of files, moving a task to another block aren't necessarily as important to distinguish these. What we also found is that a classifier is fairly accurate, but is often misclassifying a patch as a minor or a minor as a patch. So the distinction between these two version types is a bit fuzzy. So we looked into these misclassifications in more detail. What we actually found is that the classifier oftentimes isn't necessarily wrong. We found multiple cases where a patch version introduces new variables and would be seen as adding more flexibility to the client and thus adding more functionality and should have probably been a minor version. What we also find is a couple of cases where patches or minors actually introduce new breaking changes by removing variables or removing platforms and should have probably been a major version increment, whereas some major version increments don't necessarily make any breaking changes and could have been weaker. In general, we find that these developers seem to follow some semantics, but the semantics aren't consistently applied among developers. So to conclude this study, we found that there are indeed some implicit rules that role developers follow when versioning their roles, but that they don't consistently follow these rules. We also found that breaking changes are things like removing variables or changing the variable type or removing platforms and things like that, whereas the addition of functionality is often paired with giving a client more flexibility in the form of new variables or new platforms to use in the role. To quickly recap our contributions, we gathered a large dataset of Ansible roles and their accompanying versions. We also created a structural model for these roles and created a domain-specific structural change extraction algorithm that is able to detect more than 40 different change types happening between these role versions. Finally, of course, we did an empirical study on the versioning of these roles in a completely novel ecosystem, which, to the best of our knowledge, nobody has ever considered before. With that, I conclude my presentation. I thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.